last long. Having read the talking points that were scrambled into his hands by nervous Republicans for almost an entire day, Donald Trump pulled a full Charlottesville today, praising his supporters who chanted, "Send her back," to attack Congresswoman Ilhan Omar at his North Carolina campaign rally as, quote, incredible patriots. Yep. Just 24 hours ago, Trump, per those nervous Republican talking points, claimed that he disapproved of the racist chant about Congresswoman Omar, and he even tried to stop it, he says. He got some nice headlines that were claiming that he was disavowing the chant from some in the news media who indulged in the perennial false balance tick of pretending whatever the president says is true and it's a given fact. But not everybody fell for the banana in the tailpipe.
President Trump, you said you were unhappy with the chant. However, the chant was just repeating what you said in your tweet. Do you take that tweet back?
You know what I'm unhappy with? I'm unhappy with the fact that a congresswoman can hate our country. Those people in North Carolina, that stadium was packed. It was a record crowd, and I could have filled it 10 times, as you know. Those are incredible people. Those are incredible patriots. But I'm unhappy when a congresswoman goes and said, I'm going to be the president's nightmare. She's going to be the president's nightmare. She's lucky to be where she is, let me tell you.
And Donald Trump didn't even stop doing the underlying thing and just kept on fanning the flames that, to be clear, put her in danger by continuing to attack Congresswoman Omar. Trump has provided zero evidence that Congresswoman Omar ever said that she hates the United States. And earlier this week, she in fact said, quote, I probably love this country more than anyone that is naturally born. But for Trump supporters, who cares what the actual facts are, since whatever he says or tweets is the news. Hours later, Trump broadened his attacks to include all 4 members of the squad, Omar, as well as Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, and Rashida Tlaib.
You can't speak about our country the way those 4 congressmen, they said garbage. They say things about Israel that's so bad, I'm not even going to repeat them right now. They can't get away with that act. Not the right thing.
They can't get away with it. Trump's statement, as the Washington Post points out, is at odds with the Constitution, which grants every American the right of free speech. But details. The continued attacks and the support for people who shouted a racist chant is becoming standard Trump playbook, where the Republican Party now faces the daunting possibility of having to own, as the theme of the 2020 campaign, that kind of rhetoric. Meanwhile, real leaders are speaking up. And they're not offering the mealy-mouthed both sides rhetoric that avoids confronting Donald Trump, like we've heard from Mitch McConnell and other wobbly-kneed Republicans. Former First Lady Michelle Obama issued a rare rebuke on Twitter, saying, what truly makes our country great is its diversity. I've seen that beauty in so many ways over the years, whether we are born here or seek refuge here. There's a place for us all. We must remember it's not my America or your America, it's our America. And the condemnation, the disgust aimed at the President of the United States isn't just local, it's global. Here's Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
I think the comments made were hurtful, wrong, and completely unacceptable. And I want everyone in Canada to know that those comments are completely unacceptable and should not be allowed or encouraged in Canada.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel had an even stronger criticism of the president's racist attacks on 4 American congresswomen.
Sind Sie persönlich, und ich bitte um eine persönliche Antwort, fühlen Sie sich persönlich solidarisch mit den attackierten Frauen?
Ja. Ja. Ich distanziere mich davon entschieden und fühle mich solidarisch mit den 3 attackierten Frauen.
The world is watching. And today, it is the United States of America, the former beacon of the free world, that is the subject of global revulsion and disgust because of the raw, ugly racism and ethno-nationalism of our president. As for the congresswomen at the center of Donald Trump's racist attacks, they're showing the strength and the resilience that actually is what this country is supposed to be about, and refusing to back down in the face of Trump's ugliness.
It's taken us 240 years for us to have this unique composite of a Congress in this moment, and we will not go back. We will not go back. We will not go back to the days of injustice. We will not roll back our rights. We will not deny liberty to our trans brothers and sisters. We will not deny our own humanity at the border. We will not go back. We will go forward. But we sure as hell will not stand still.
Leading off our discussion tonight are Daniela Gibbs-Leger, former special assistant to President Obama, and she's the executive vice president of communications and strategy for the Center for American Progress, and Tara Dowdell, Democratic strategist and the president of the Tara Dowdell Group, and she was a contestant on the third season of The Apprentice. I'm going to start with you, Tara, here at the table. I mean, you've been very open even during the campaign of saying Donald Trump's a racist.
Right.
Okay, full stop. We know that from his history. But where he's going now is separate from racism, it's white nationalism, right? And that is defined as wanting to have a country that is for white people, right? And that kind of rhetoric, that's not something I think even the Republican Party was prepared for. But did it surprise you that he's now openly going in that direction?
It doesn't surprise me at all, because he's been escalating. He's been testing the waters all along. He saw that he got away with saying Mexicans were rapists. He saw that he got away with attacking Congresswoman Maxine Waters, saying she was low IQ. His consistent attacks against women of color, women generally, but in particular women of color. We saw that with April Ryan. Remember that whole episode?
Yep.
We saw that with Abby Phillips. We saw that with a number of black female journalists. And so I think that he's tested the waters. He's seen that his base has not only responded well, but responded extremely well and are parroting back those things that he's saying. So because he's escalated his behavior, it was no surprise to me that he would continue to do it until he stopped.
Yeah.
That's what, to me, that is what this is indicative of, that until someone stops Donald Trump, until he's held accountable, he's seeing that he's not going to be held accountable by his own party.
Yeah.
He's seeing that the base is going to reward it and is rewarding it. And he's seeing that the Democratic Party hasn't really done much to hold him accountable. So why would he stop?
Yeah. I mean, Daniela, you worked for one of Donald Trump's chief triggers, right? President Obama. And when Donald Trump led the birtherism crusade, that crusade produced a lot of threats to President Obama, who already had the most threats of any president before him, because he was black and a black man, serving as the president of the United States. Well, now what we've seen is that fellow Democrats are afraid. They're actually afraid for the lives of these women, particularly Ilhan Omar. Politico is reporting that senior Democrats are now calling for authorities to evaluate security for Ilhan Omar, as well as the 3 other lawmakers who Trump called out by name at his Wednesday night rally in North Carolina, warning that Trump has escalated the risk of threats or even acts of violence toward the 4 minority freshmen. Let me quickly play Amy Klobuchar, who is from Representative Omar's state. She's a senator from that state, and here she is now.
One is what he's saying to the people of this country about the nature of immigrants, where we all come from immigrants. The second is that he's actually putting her in a threat situation. He's putting her at risk. If I were her, I would, immediately call the FBI and say, what do I need for protection? Do you think I need more protection? Are there threats? It's hard to believe she's not going to get threats coming out of a rally like that was on every TV station in our country this morning.
I mean, Danielle, have you ever thought that you'd see the president of the United States become a physical threat to a member of Congress, let alone any American citizen?
I honestly, I never thought I would see the day. I have a podcast that I co-host for CAP, and I was ranting this week about how, I used to hear the go back to Africa and things like that when I was a kid growing up, and I never thought that I would hear those words from the President of the United States. And it is clear that he does not care that his words are potentially putting these women's lives in danger. Congresswoman Omar was walking down the street the other day, and I was legitimately worried and concerned about her safety because it didn't appear that she had any security around her. And, I just want to echo something that Tara said. Like, the reason why Donald Trump is doing this is because he can. because he's getting away with it, because nobody is checking him, because his party, they have decided that they are okay with white nationalism, they are okay with racism, because it'll allow them to, what, get their tax cuts passed? It'll allow them to stack the courts with right-wing judges. They don't care about the safety of their fellow members of Congress. They don't care about the decorum of the presidency of the United States. They just care about protecting the wealthy few. And I don't know if you can hear it in my voice, but it really is upsetting and irritating.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to read a little bit of a St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and then I have two questions for you, Tara. So the St. Louis Post-Dispatch editorial board called out Republicans who haven't condemned Trump, saying, given the bright red line that Trump is so enthusiastically crossed this week, the question of whether to continue supporting him either assertively or through inappropriate silence is no longer merely an indicator of party loyalty or party priorities. It's become a test of courage, character, and fundamental decency. All of these elected officials have failed it. Two questions on Republicans. They could have gotten tax cuts for the rich, guacked up the rivers with pollution and let the polluters pollute. All those policies that they want, the judges, same judges would have been Jeb Bush's judges, Marco Rubio's judges. They could have gotten the same policies. So what does it say about the party that they'd rather have this guy who's specifically using an ethno-nationalist set of tropes in order to remain in power?
It says what I said this yesterday. I was asked by one of your colleagues on Hardball. I was asked if Donald Trump was going to stand behind his disavowal, right? And I said he was not going to stand behind his disavowal. I said he was going to backtrack, and I was right. I said just like he did in Charlottesville, like you said at the top of the show, that's what he was going to do. Donald Trump saw, and I'll say this again, and I'm going to keep saying it, he saw the writing on the wall with the Republican Party. He saw that reaction that the Republican Party had to President Obama's presidency. People literally lost their minds over this black man becoming president.
So did he.
And he did too. But I wanted to point something out. When President Obama was first elected, Donald Trump praised him. At the very beginning. But when he saw how the party responded to President Obama, people calling him all kinds of racist names who were party officials across this country, not just any old people. These were party officials who were calling Michelle Obama a monkey and ape in heels, all of that stuff. He saw that, and he knew that the Republican Party, they wanted to do their racism through dog whistles. They wanted to do it through a whisper, through where they could have plausible deniability if someone called them out. Trump saw that the base wanted it out front.
Yeah.
He saw that, and so he rode that wave through birtherism and has continued to ride that wave, but he did not incite the party or bring the party along. The party was already there.
They were already there. Very quickly before I go back to Danielle, does he care if one of these women gets hurt, do you think? You know him.
I don't think he cares, because the only thing Donald Trump cares about is himself. He talked about having people riot if he didn't win the election.
Yeah. I mean, this was the guy who also wanted to have a black versus white apprentice, to have literally a race fight on The Apprentice. Danielle, for the Democrats then, the response so far, I think, has been smart. It's been unity. It's been sticking together. It's saying it doesn't matter what your differences are with these women's policies. The policies don't matter. Trump didn't attack the policies. He attacked them in their bodies. He attacked them because of they're brown and black, period. That's it. But is there some other action that Democrats, in your view, should be taking that's stronger than condemnation?
Yeah, I think that, well, first of all, I just want to say I am glad at least that they all stood together and they did pass that resolution out of the House. But I think they need to keep talking about this, but they also need to tie it to the fact that this president is an ineffective, awful president, that he made a bunch of promises to people that he has broken, and they need to tie it all together, because I think the American people understand that he's a racist. They understand the words that they are saying, but I think they also need to understand that they're tie the racism with his policies and what he's not doing for the American people. And they need to also highlight the fact that while he's doing all of this, he's trying to take away their health care. While they're doing all of this, they're being inhumane treatment is happening at the border. So they need to tie it all together and make people understand that, like, Donald Trump is a vortex of awful, and this is why he needs to be voted out of office.
Yeah, it'd be good to find it's the shiny keys of racism while he's essentially picking the Americans' pockets and giving it all to the rich right in front of his supporters' faces, and shiny keys of racism. It's pretty incredible. Daniela Gibbs-Leger and Tara Dowdell, thank you both very much.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.